Alright, so a really long time ago in Netherfield Park, this guy named Charles Bingley comes and he's like renting it. Mrs. Bennet is like totally stoked because she has 5 unmarried daughters. The goal, the objective of life for young girls was to get married and just have babies. Mr. Bingley like goes away for a while, but he comes back to Netherfield and there's like a ball going on, which today is called like parties. Mr. Bingley, along with his good friend Mr. Darcy, attends the ball, and so do the Bennet daughters, in hopes to maybe get acquainted with some of them. Jane, the oldest daughter, ends up dancing with Mr. Bingley. They surprisingly really like each other because later Mr. Bingley is telling his friend, Darcy, how beautiful Jane is, how beautiful of a creature she is that he has ever beheld. Bingley suggests that Darcy dance with Elizabeth, the second oldest daughter of the Bennets, but Darcy refuses, saying she is
perfectly tolerable, I dare say. Not handsome enough to tempt me.
And Elizabeth is like, not kidding. She doesn't even care, but she does refuse to dance with Darcy any other time in existence, and she starts to get a little dislike upon him.
A few days later, after they get home from the ball, Jane gets a letter from Miss Bingley saying that she wants her to dine with them tonight. Her mother's like, you have to go on horseback in the rain. And it turns out she did get sick the next day. Elizabeth goes to take care of Jane. A couple days later, when Jane is feeling a little bit better, but she's not completely recovered from her illness, Miss Bennet comes over to check to see how Jane is. And she's like, oh no, she's far too unwell for her to be moved, so she has to stay here a couple more days. Is that okay, Mr. Bingley? And he's always like, of course, yeah, why not? The next day, she feels better, so they go home, and Mrs. Bennet is like, why are you home so soon? Like, seriously, you should have stayed there a little bit longer.
After the Bennet sisters returned home, they had found out that their cousin, Mr. Collins, the heir to the house that they are currently residing in, will be coming over. Mr. Collins comes to the house and starts complimenting his future ownings. Mrs. Bennet is very displeased because Mr. Collins is only complimenting everything because she knows that he has future heir to it and is trying to suck up. Later, all the sisters go on a walk in which they run into a young gentleman named Mr. Wickham. Elizabeth instantly takes a liking into him. They begin to have a conversation in which is interrupted by Mr. Darcy, who is also there with Mr. Wickham. Elizabeth watched as Mr. Darcy became furious, whereas Mr. Wickham became white as snow. The youngest of the 5 sisters approaches Bingley, asks him when he's going to throw the ball, and ends up pressuring him to it. They go home and they prepare for their ball in Netherfield. Once at the ball, Mr. Collins seems to be clinging onto Elizabeth, and she's like, no, stop talking to me. You're annoying, you're old, I know you're just trying to marry me. I want to find Mr. Wickham, to which Mr. Wickham didn't come to the ball. She's like, damn, my hot guy isn't here, so I guess I'm going to have to talk to the other hot guy, Darcy. Darcy and Elizabeth, they start dancing, and Darcy creates a pleasant conversation. Elizabeth's like, why are you creating a pleasant conversation? You're not nice to talk to. And then they return home. Mr. Collins proposes to Elizabeth, and Elizabeth has to try her hardest not to laugh, and she's like, no, I reject you. Her mother gets really pissed off. Her mother gets really mad and is like, listen, you gotta marry him. You gotta go tell him, you gotta go beg for him to take you back. Otherwise, I will never see you. And Elizabeth goes to her dad, and he's like, yeah, well, if you would have married him, I wouldn't have talked to you. And Elizabeth's like, I like my dad better, so I'm not gonna marry him. Mr. Collins is rejected, so he takes back his proposal. And then he marries Elizabeth's best friend, Charlotte. DICK move. Meanwhile, while all this drama is happening, Jane, the oldest Bennet sister, is having problems in paradise with her perfect relationship. Her hot man is moving to London, apparently forever, says his sister. Days pass, and their aunt comes and visit, and they can see that Jane is clearly distraught over the whole situation between her and Bingley. So she offers to bring her to London, to which she agrees, and Elizabeth also comes. Elizabeth then goes and stays with Mr. and Mrs. Collins and meets Lady Catherine. Once they go stay with the Collins, Elizabeth sees that Lady Catherine's kind of a bitch and like nobody actually really likes her. She's super high class and fancy and stupid. Elizabeth goes on a bunch of walks and she bumps into Darcy on like all of them, which is apparently a coincidence. But then one day, instead of running into Mr. Darcy, she runs into what's his name? Colonel Fitzwilliam instead of Mr. Darcy one day, which is Mr. Darcy's companion for the trip to London. Fitzwilliam ends up explaining to Elizabeth that Mr. Darcy felt that Mr. Bingley owed him for getting him out of a bad relationship between Jane and him. Elizabeth goes home and she contemplates everything. It's like, so how am I supposed to tell my sister that, not her fault that he left her? There's supposed to be some type of dinner. Elizabeth didn't want to go, so she stayed home that night. Mr. Darcy comes knocking on her door. So she sees that it's him and is like, why are you here? Like, no. And he goes, I was worried. Mr. Darcy confesses his love to Elizabeth and proposes and asks for her hand in marriage. And Elizabeth goes, no, all sassily, and like turns her shoulder towards him. He gets angry, and then they get angry at each other and start yelling. The next day, Elizabeth is walking through the garden and runs into Mr. Darcy yet again, and to which Mr. Darcy gives her a letter that explains his attitude and why he felt the need to break up Jane and Mr. Bingley, his relationship between Mr. Wickham and what really happened between the two. And in that letter, it explains that Mr. Wickham, who Elizabeth was so fond of, was actually lying about his whole past life and his relationship with Mr. Darcy.
So your girl Elizabeth is contemplating if Mr. Darcy's really telling the truth about Mr. Wickham. Well, then she does a little digging, and she finds out that Mr. Darcy is telling the truth. Elizabeth is completely mortified about how she acted towards Mr. Darcy.
I think she's acted prejudice.
She's acted prejudice. So after she talks to her aunt and uncle decide that she should come over to Pemberley. Little did your girl Elizabeth know Mr. Darcy owns Pemberley. She runs into him because that's when she realizes, crap, he lives here. She starts talking with him. She apologizes. So she saw how she acted towards him and that she should have never acted that way towards him. Mr. Darcy accepts her apology because, he's your boy. He's your boy, Mr. Darcy. After the apology, they start to get close with each other. Well, then he asked her, he was like, yo, you know what, who you should meet? You should meet my sister. So she agrees to meet his sister. And it turns out his sister is a lot more shy than what she had heard before from Mr. Wickham. Well, they meet. They get along pretty well. A few days later, she receives a letter from Jane saying, hey, you need to get home, like, right now. Lydia is gone. She just up and left, She's a runaway with Mr. Wickham, you need to come and, help us situate this out, And she tells Mr. Darcy about what the situation, and he says it's fine, he understands, because she had to leave early. Once Elizabeth arrives home, the entire family is freaking out. They're like, where the heck is she? They don't know where she is. Later on, Jane asked her aunt and uncle if they could possibly come and help. Well, they were never really fans of Lydia at all. But they agreed because they realized, family's important. After they arrive, the uncle heads up to London with Mr. Bennet to go search for Lydia. Mrs. Bennet is very distraught about losing her daughter because she's like, girl, I don't know where you is. I don't know where you at.
I am not putting that in there.
They finally receive a letter from Mr. Bennet saying that they found Lydia and that she is going to marry Mr. Wickham. At this point, Mrs. Bennet gets all happy that she's finally going to have one of her daughters married off, the youngest, even though Lydia is 16. A few months later, the wedding happens between Lydia and Mr. Wickham, and Elizabeth and Mr. Wickham talked at the rehearsal dinner, because they have no choice, and they decide that they're going to leave what they had behind.
After Lydia's wedding, Lady Catherine de Bourgh, she comes to the Bennets and she wants to talk to Elizabeth specifically. Lady de Bourgh, she's all like, you need to not marry Mr. Darcy. He's supposed to marry my daughter, even though they're like cousins, which is normal at this time. Elizabeth is over here just like, nah, I ain't doing that. Excuse you, ma'am. Lady Catherine de Bourgh walks off. She storms out of the place. She's like, you're very disgraceful. You're a very rude girl. And then again, Elizabeth's just like, nah.
A few days later, Jane finds out the truth about Mr. Bingley. He actually ends up returning to Netherfield. They end up meeting and they end up falling in love again. And he proposes because he's like, yo, girl, like, I'm sorry I left. They're engaged. While they're planning the wedding, Mr. Bennet receives a letter from Mr. Collins congratulating Jane and Elizabeth on the marriage proposals. And Mr. Bennet was like, I don't remember Elizabeth getting engaged. And it turns out that Mr. Darcy was going to propose again to Elizabeth. He calls Elizabeth into the room and says, yo, turns out you're gonna be getting engaged here soon as well. So yeah, you better go tell your mother. Elizabeth meets up with Mr. Darcy and he proposes again.
Elizabeth says yes, and they end up getting married around the same time that Jane and Mr. Bingley gets married.
And then that's the end.
And everybody goes on with the rest of their lives.
That's the end.
That's the end.
Bye.
That's the end. The end.